今日は2030年の中国の軍事力と日米同盟と題しまして、東京財団も、少し協力をさせていただきましたが、カーネギー国際平和財団の、皆様による最新のリポートをご披露いただくということになっております。今日ご登壇いただいておりますのはお二方いらっしゃいます。向かって右側、マイケル・スウェインさんです。お手元の資料に略歴がございますが、カーネギー国際平和財団上席研究員でいらっしゃいます。ご略歴はハーバード大学で博士号をお取りになり、ランド研究所で上席政策アナリストをお務めになった後、現在のこのカーネギー国際平和財団にて中国の安全保障問題に従事していらっしゃいます。そういう意味ではご専門に関するご著書、論考、そういったものは大変たくさんございまし、お持ちでいらっしゃいまして、今日はそういうことも含めていろいろとご発表いただけると思います。そして向かって左側、マイク・モチヅキさんです。ジョージ・ワシントン大学アソシエイト・ディーンということで、マイクさんもハーバード大学で、博士号を取得され、南カリフォルニア大学やイェール大学で教鞭をお取りになり、またブルッキングス研究所上席研究員などもお務めでいらっしゃいます。2001年から2005年までジョージ・ワシントン大学エリオット国際関係大学院のガストン・シーグアジア研究センター所長も務められましたので、日米関係に関係する方はご存知の方も大変多いのではないかと思われます。最初にご講演いただく前にですね、今日の趣旨につきまして、東京財団の理事長秋山よりですね、簡単にご挨拶も兼ねてお話しさせていただきます。
日本もだいぶ暑くなってきましたが、今日たくさんの方がご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。多くの友人もいるようで、後でのクエスチョンアンサーが楽しいことになろうと思っております。またアメリカからはマイケル・スウェインさん、あるいはマイク・モチヅキさんと書いてありますが、お二人のマイクさんお二人がお越しいただきまして本当にありがとうございます。今ちょっと説明もありましたように、カーネギー国際平和財団が先般ですね、2030年の時点における、中国の軍事力と日米同盟というレポートを出しまして、これをですね、日本でも発信をする、あるいは日本でもそのディスカッションをして、皆さんとシェアするというようなことを考えまして、実は我々東京財団がこの第61回の東京財団フォーラムという形でこれをやろうということになりました。東京財団でこういうことができるということについても大変私たち光栄に思っているところでございます。2030年に向けていろいろなですね、レポートがあると思いますけれども、この2030年の時点における、中国の軍事力と、日米同盟という捉え方は大変ある意味でユニークだと思います。日中間とかですね、米中間とかですね、先週スウェインさんとも私北京で、米中のクライシスマネジメント危機管理会議というものに出席しました。ただ今回は尖閣諸島の問題がテーマだったもんですから、日本からも3人行きましたけれども、基本的に米中とかですね、日中とかそういう議論が多いわけですけれども、中国と日米同盟という捉え方、これは一つユニークな捉え方だと思います。実は確かマイク・ブシンスさんも参加されたと思いますけれども、2002年にスティムソンセンターでですね、An Alliance for Engagement っていうレポートです。この時は確か日米同盟と中国ということを考えた、あれが最初かと思います。それからネットアセスメントですよね。で、絶対評価で中国の軍事力がどうなるのか、あるいはアメリカの軍事力がどうなるのかっていうような議論がたくさんあるわけですけれども、これを相対評価で、この分析をして、 ここで、考えるというのも大変重要なことで、2030年に向けてその中国の軍事力がどうなるのか、どの軍事力が増えるのか、そのオペレーションはどうなるのか、あるいはその米国の軍事力、あるいは日米同盟のその合わせた力がどうなるのかということを相対評価するということが非常に重要ではないかと思っております。そういう意味で非常にユニークなその分析だと思いますし、かつこのレポートのサブタイトルが戦略的ネットアセスメントということになっておりまして、戦略的というその意味は、必ずしも軍事力の比較だけではなくて、経済力、政治力、あるいはソフトパワー、その他いろいろなものも考えて、2030年の中国と日米同盟の相対評価を戦略的に考えるというようなことかと思います。大変その興味深いことではあると思います。このレポートを作成、あるいはその作業をする段階で、実はこのカーネギー国際平和財団の関係の担当者と東京財団は一度意見交換をしております。今日後で、パネラーに参加するジェネラル山口とかですね、あるいは渡辺上席研究員も確か参加したと思いますので、そういう意味では我々全く無関係ではない。いずれにいたしましても、こういう機会でこの2030年の中国の軍事力と、それから日米同盟ということについてここで発表をし、議論をするということは大変有意義なことだろうと思っております。以上で私の最初の挨拶にさせていただきます。
それでは早速プレゼンテーションの方をお願いしたいと思います。先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Good. Okay. Hands are waving. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning at the Tokyo Foundation. And on behalf of my colleague Mike and the other people involved in this project, I want to thank the Tokyo Foundation for sponsoring us, and Akiyama-san in particular. As he said, we were just in Beijing together at a different event, but one that also still involved China. So today, I'd like to take you through the main points of this report that we've produced that looks out the next 15 to 20 years at the impact of China's military and China's foreign and defense policies on Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance. And as Akiyama-san said, this is what we call a strategic net assessment. What that means is that we are trying to look at the major variables, the major factors that operate in China, Japan, and the United States over this time period that would likely influence the evolution of the security environment surrounding Japan and affecting the alliance. So what this study does is it really looks at the interactive nature of the different players, not just militarily, but also in many non-military areas, including some domestic political issues, economic issues, social issues, etc. And the purpose is not to predict the future. This study does not say this is what's going to happen. The study really tries to define a range of possible futures and to assess the features of each one of those futures, defined as a regional security environment. And then it tries to assess the likely probability. And then it tries to look at several different possible responses to these different futures that could be adopted by the alliance, by the U.S. and Japan. Now, it's a lot of information, and the report itself is nearly 400 pages. So I'm not going to put you all to sleep by going into the great details on this, although we do have an executive summary as well. And as was said, we're going to have the briefing available. This full briefing is also going to be available if you want to download it and look at the details, because I will be skipping over quite a lot of this briefing. It has 40 slides. That's a lot. So I will focus on the most important, what we think are the most important parts. So I will make some initial comments on that, and then my colleague, Mike Mochizuki will make his comments on various aspects of the report. And keep in mind also, this report was not just written by us. Altogether, there were 9 authors, 9 different authors of this report, 5 major authors, but then some other authors who also assisted us. And we each focused on different parts of the report. But I was the person in charge of organizing the report and pulling together all the different parts. And I probably contributed the most to the writing of the report in various chapters. So if you want to blame somebody, you probably can blame me. Let me start here by just showing, you can see here, we're going to, first of all, I'll give you what are kind of what we call the bottom line findings. What are the most important, if you will, conclusions or takeaways from the report that you might be interested in? Then I'll very briefly talk about the kind of variables that we looked at. And I should say that our research methods involved both materials research and interviewing. We conducted interviews over more than one occasion in the United States and in Japan. And in China, we did do one series of interviews during a single trip there during the study. But most of the interviews were probably focused in the United States and Japan. And then we, of course, examined a wide range of materials available in Japanese, English, and Chinese to produce the report. There are individual country, what we call trajectories, analyses of each of the 3 major countries in the report. They each have a very substantial chapter that focuses on the key trends and features of each country affecting the security environment now and the likely trends and developments in those countries over time. And then we base that, we use those country trajectories, and there are different alternative trajectories for each country. We use that to develop a series of regional scenarios, as I mentioned before. And then we discuss some kind of responses. So let's go first of all to the key findings in this study. Our first most important finding is that we don't see that the issue involving Japan and the alliance with China is one of war or peace. We think it's very unlikely in this time frame of 15 to 20 years that China and the alliance or China and Japan are actually going to come to military conflict of any substantial nature over this time frame. We think the most likely challenges that will happen will be twofold and related, as we say up here. It really is the key challenge is China's growing capabilities and growing presence, both military and non-military, and its growing economic influence are likely to change the security environment around Japan so that China will have more leverage. It will have more influence, quite possibly relative to the U.S. as well as Japan in this part of Asia over this time frame, so that it could try to achieve certain objectives and would do so through greater leverage, including possibly intimidation or levels of coercion under some circumstances, short of conflict. And related to that, in the second point, is that this possibility, therefore, increases the possibility that we could see more of the types of crises that we've seen thus far regarding for example, the Senkaku Islands dispute with China. We see it very possible that there will be more of these in the future, absent some very significant types of new security assurances between China and the alliance. Now, why do we draw these conclusions? Well, we see that, as I said a minute ago, China's military capabilities are likely to increase in absolute terms in many, many different areas. And we look at 6 different military domains. I'll show them in a second. We examine those. And we see that it's very likely that China will have absolute gains over this time period in many, if not all, of those domains. They will just simply be more capable, both militarily and also in terms of what you call paramilitary capabilities. That is to say, their China maritime surveillance, fisheries administration, their capacity to put ships and aircraft into the area, particularly in disputed areas or near disputed areas. We also see that it's possible under some circumstances that China's capabilities will increase in relative terms. That is to say, they will make gains compared to Japan in particular, but also possibly compared to the United States as well. As a result of this, as you see in the second to last bullet, if you can see it, I know it's rather low, I'm not sure you can all see it, but what we say is that the past level of American primacy in the Western Pacific, that is to say, the level of superiority of American maritime capability and air capability, is likely to diminish, to go down. And under some circumstances, it could go down very significantly. Now, again, we're talking about this part of the world. We're not talking about all of Asia, much less the whole planet. We're talking about this particular area. And so we see that past primacy that the U.S. has enjoyed for about 60 years since the end of the Second World War is likely to change. It may not go away entirely, the primacy, but it could very much be under more challenge. And the last point we make in general is that Japan is probably unlikely to make up the difference. In other words, Japan's willingness and ability, whether it be politically or otherwise, to make up the difference in any relative decline that the U.S. might experience is unlikely to occur for a variety of reasons that we go into in some detail in the study. So what does this mean for the future? Well, it means our bottom line is that there's going to be a much more challenging environment for the alliance to operate in. It's going to require very more concerted, more thorough, more deft, more sophisticated diplomacy and political interaction, both within the alliance and with China, in order to maintain a sufficient level and confidence in stability and in economic development in the region. And efforts to sustain the level of primacy that the U.S. has enjoyed in the military area could prove to be either very provocative for China or not feasible for economic and political reasons. And I'll touch on what that means. We also conclude that there are no easy alternatives to the past post-war structure that focused very much on the American position in the Western Pacific. There's no easy alternative such as a balance of power, a real balance of power, or a collective security structure for this part of the world. Now, the good news is we also think that some of the worst case possible outcomes, for example, an Asian Cold War, a very intense Sino-Japanese rivalry that is short of war but still very intense, much, much beyond what we've seen now, or a U.S. withdrawal or hollowing out in the region. All of these things we see as much less likely in the future. It's going to be a much less clear kind of situation than any of those possibilities might suggest. We also think that skillful diplomacy, as I said a minute ago, could make a big difference in smoothing a lot of the rough edges and the tensions that are likely to occur in the future as a result of the kind of military and other dynamics that we point to. And we also try to account for the fact that, after all, there are a lot of uncertainties. We're not predicting here. There are many different things that could happen that in some cases are singular events, a crisis of some kind, or the opposite, a breakthrough of some kind, for example, on the Taiwan issue or on the Korean Peninsula. These things could radically change the security environment in the region in either positive or negative directions. We try to account for these to some degree in the study, but because you can't predict too many of these things, it's very hard to build them in as a specific event that's going to influence a specific outcome at a point in time. Now, those are basically our fundamental conclusions that we bring away from that we present in the report. And they're based upon certain, I should just say a word, they're based upon certain fundamental understandings about the nature of this security environment. On the one hand, you do have this increase in Chinese military capabilities, which is a big part of what I've just said. At the same time, you have an economic dynamic in the region that is pulling Japan and China closer together, not further apart. There are more incentives for avoiding the worst case outcomes. There's more incentives for avoiding a real kind of competition, a security competition in the region, in large part because of the economic dynamics that are at work. And we don't see a fundamental change in those economic dynamics. That is to say, the continued development of the Chinese economy at reasonably decent growth rates, although we have different levels of growth for China. But nonetheless, the continuation of China's development and the continuation of a close trading and investment relationship between China and Japan, China and the U.S. These things will act as a brake on some of the worst case factors that could come out of the military side. And then we also, of course, see as our one major explanatory variable is the political calculations in all three countries. And we see the political calculations there as generally continuing to support the existing policies of engagement, search for cooperation, along with what you call hedging, or the maintenance of some level of military capability that can deter the worst outcomes from the point of view of the different players. Those basic strategies are unlikely to change. But nonetheless, as I've said, a lot of other things can happen that can make it a much bigger challenge to maintain the level of cooperation and avoid the tension that could result from some of these other factors. This you can't read, I'm sure, it's too far away, but we basically list the different variables I've already mentioned that we take into account to try to understand both the country trajectories and the regional outcomes. And we end up in the country trajectories looking at defense spending and military capabilities and foreign and defense strategies as the outcomes. But then in the regional environment, we treat those factors as the independent variables leading to different types of regional environments. These are the 6 different areas of military competitions that we look at: maritime, air, ground, space, cyberspace, nuclear, and command and control. And there is quite a lot of discussion in the report about changes in these relative capabilities between China, Japan, and China and the alliance. But I'm certainly not going to list those here. Now, we have a lot of different, these are the different analyses on the country trajectories, but I'm not going to go into the details on this because of time. We really have a limited amount of time here, and I don't want to get into the details too much. Let me just say that for China, we see it as most likely that China is going to continue at fairly decent growth rates, as I said. And the real difference is between a China that is able to use those growth rates at a higher level and support some of its deployments and some of its assertiveness, and a more cautious China that will likely not be quite so assertive in many ways. And we examine all of these. And these are all different factors that we look at that are simply too much to cover here. For Japan, we have also a similar kind of trajectory analysis here. And as I said earlier, we don't postulate a major shift in either Japanese economic capabilities or Japanese basic defense doctrine and strategy and foreign policies, although you can get variations of either a hard or a soft hedging in Japan, that is to say, a greater or lesser emphasis on certain military dimensions. In the U.S., we see basically three different alternatives. A strong, very much recovered U.S., in many ways recovered, a faltering U.S., where it's still struggling to overcome its domestic economic and, to some extent, political problems. And we also examine the possibility of a U.S. withdrawal or hollowing out. We see that as highly unlikely. And so it's not given a lot of emphasis, but we examine it nonetheless. And we see the consequences of it that could occur in the alliance and in the relationship with China. So, what do we end up with? Well, we end up by saying that there are 6 different types of regional environments that we could see by the year 2030. One of them, which we think is probably the most likely, is indeed this environment where the past primacy of the U.S. and of the alliance is eroding. But the U.S. is still seen to be the dominant power. It's not as dominant as it was. So you have, and I'll talk about the more details in a second. The second one is one where we call limited conflict. What I mean by conflict here is not actual military battle, but real serious crises that could occur. They would be bounded, likely to be limited, but they could nonetheless occur. And actually, the first 2 scenarios are pretty close in likelihood. We say most likely for eroding balance, but the limited conflict scenario is pretty much up there as well, pretty highly likely as well. A third option that is possible, but not as likely as the first 2, is what we call mitigated threat. That basically says that China's growth rates are not going to be as high and its military spending as high as expected. So the ability of China to put assets in the area around Japan and to exert leverage on Japan will just not be as great as in the previous 2. So you will have less of a threat in that sense, or I should say less of a challenge. The last 3 options are ones that we see as distinctly less likely. The Asian Cold War, which is a real version in the 21st century of the Cold War that existed in the 20th century, is a certain possibility, but we just don't see it as likely. In large part because of the economic and political incentives that I've already described in general that we think will still exist and restrain all sides from discarding their existing strategy of engagement combined with hedging. The last 2, a Sino-centric Asia and an intense Sino-Japanese rivalry beyond the Cold War type, these are very unlikely, but they would both be precipitated by an American withdrawal or an American hollowing out. One of them would be a more beneficial, if you will, or gradual withdrawal, which would be a Sino-centric Asia. The second would be one where the U.S. makes a rather precipitate withdrawal, and the results are very chaotic. As I say, however, we don't go into a huge amount of detail. These different scenario summaries here just basically summarize what I just said. And they're based upon different trajectories for the eroding balance and the limited conflict and the mitigated threat, as well as the other three. I'm sorry skipping through these, but it's just simply too much. We couldn't cover it all in the time. And we can discuss more what we see as the critical differences on this in the Q&A and the commentary. I'm sure we'll cover this as well. At the end, we look at three different types of responses that we could get to this environment. The first one is what we call a robust forward presence. By responses, I mean responses by the US and Japan. This is one that is designed to retain a clear level of American predominance in the Western Pacific, to have no erosion, and to do so by one of two possible strategies on the military side, at least. One of them is something that probably some of you are familiar with. It's the concept called air-sea battle. It's a very ambitious, probably offensively oriented concept that's designed to negate any of the capabilities that China would deploy offshore over this time frame. And it's based upon a very ambitious set of assumptions about how the U.S. could operate. And it probably involves the potential, having the capability to conduct strikes deep within Chinese territory as a deterrent against China's behavior. It would also involve a range of other factors that would be very much oriented towards preemptively stopping China from carrying out any kind of activities that might be a threat in the Western Pacific. The alternative to this is something that's called offshore control. That's variant B. That is a variation in which the orientation is not to go into China. It's more to contain China through a blockade at distance in what's called the first island chain, or about 1,500 nautical miles from China. That is designed to avoid being within the range of China's military assets in this part of the world, because they will mostly focus on that 1,500 nautical mile region. So this option is designed to pull back to some degree from that and have the potential of a blockade against China as a deterrent. Again, it's a deterrent. Now, I should hasten to add that these strategies both have a diplomatic element, and that diplomatic element is still one of trying to cooperate with China. These two military strategies are intended to remain in the background as deterrent capabilities. But we assess that it's going to be very hard to maintain the cooperative diplomatic approach while you're trying to put in place either the air-sea battle or the offshore control. The two kinds of objectives could increasingly come into conflict with each other in dealing with China. And they could also make escalation in a crisis more likely if you have those doctrines in place, particularly air-sea battle. So we assess both the pros and cons of this and the other two approaches. Now, the second basic approach is what we call conditional offense-defense. And that approach is really one in which the U.S. still tries to retain its level of superiority, but it's not as clear, it's not as much as in the first option. It's not based upon a very ambitious strategy of striking deep into China or putting in place a containment blockade. It's more focused on just dealing with China's ability to deploy assets into the maritime theater beyond its borders. It's also one, though, that emphasizes very much diplomacy and trying to reach higher levels of reassurance between China and the alliance in a variety of areas: Korea, Taiwan, South China Sea, possibly even in the issues in the East China Sea. So this one is a strong diplomatic and military side, but it's still oriented towards retaining some level of primacy. The last one is what we call defensive balancing. This response is a more genuine balance of power, where the United States and the alliance don't focus so much on countering China's capabilities across the board or offshore. They just focus more on creating a more defensive posture to prevent China from doing certain specific things. So in effect, the Chinese have what they call counter-intervention strategy. I should have said this earlier. That is their strategy to try to prevent intervention over Taiwan, for example, or in the future possibly more intervention in the East China Sea. Well, this strategy would have the mirror image of that, and the U.S. would be trying to prevent China from doing certain things, and the two would basically balance one another. This would be a much more challenging approach because it would involve some very basic changes in how the U.S. thinks about security. It would probably involve some basic changes in the nature of the alliance, and it would involve some real breakthroughs on the diplomatic front to be able to sustain a stable balance over time. But it certainly is a possibility. We don't neglect it. So that's what we basically have by way of our analysis. Now, at this point, before we discuss these other points, these are basically repeats of what I've said. I'd like to ask my colleague, Mike Mochizuki, to add some points as well. Mike.
I want to join Michael Swain in thanking the Tokyo Foundation for hosting this meeting and as well as hosting us in our 2 trips out to Japan in the research phase of this project. What I'd like to do is to talk about the Japan dimension of this study. And you might be somewhat surprised, but as we were doing the research and then trying to develop our conclusions, it was about Japan that there was the greatest debate, even heated disagreement, and it kind of showed that the kinds of choices that Japan makes in the coming years might have a dramatic impact on the nature of the regional security environment. And I think one of the reasons for the disagreements or debates that we had within our research team was that we had different kind of policy biases or prescriptions in mind, and we had to be very careful to distinguish between the kind of Japan we would like to see and the kind of Japan we are likely to get. And there was a gap on this. And one reason for this is kind of when this project took place, the time span of this. Now, first, if you think about 2030 as the target year that we're looking at, that's 17 years from now. So if you go back 17 years from today backwards, we get to 1996. So you kind of see kind of the amount of change and continuity that we might expect. It was in 1996, I believe, that Mr. Akiyama had just assumed the post as administrative vice minister of the defense agency, and General Yamaguchi was working in the defense agency helping to draft the U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Guidelines. It just seems like yesterday. So 17 years from now is not that far off. But the other thing that affected the way we looked at things was that our project started in 2009 and it ended in December 2012. And so when we started the project, the LDP was headed for defeat and we had the DPJ come to power, and Mr. Hatoyama became prime minister, and he had a very different vision for Japanese foreign policy. And then, as we were ending the project, the DPJ suffered a huge defeat, and the unthinkable Mr. Abe reassumes the prime ministership with a very different outlook. And so depending upon which data point you took, you would have very, very different trajectories about where Japan is headed. And that was one of the reasons for the intense debate. But in the end, I think we reached a basic consensus that when we're doing a net assessment, we have to look beyond particular leaders or particular elections. And so some of the key conclusions about Japan that I want to highlight are the following. First of all, there's no question that there's much greater anxiety and irritation about China in the Japanese public and in Japanese political circles. And we really don't see, unless there's a dramatic change in Chinese behavior, an upward swing in terms of Japanese perceptions, negative perceptions of China. But what we also found was that despite this anxiety and this irritation with China, this did not translate directly and proportionally to a military response to this China. There is some military response, but it was not in the direction of a really robust military response that could take up the slack of the erosion of U.S. primacy in the region. The second major conclusion is that Japan has a strategic dilemma about China and will continue to have a basic strategic dilemma. On the one hand, because of the concerns about a rising China, Japan will hug, embrace the United States, and look for the United States for protection and security reassurance. But at the same time, we expect, although there are extreme scenarios that this might not happen, but Japan will continue to see huge economic opportunities in China. And therefore, while balancing against China as a military actor, will bandwagon with China on the economic side. And this will fundamentally pull Japan in two opposite directions, and how it manages that balance will be challenging. A third conclusion is that if you look beyond the leadership, if you look at underlying economic trends, demographic trends, the resilience of non-military or anti-military norms in Japan, that all of these factors will put a brake on, or a constraint on, a major militarization of Japanese foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And despite the fact that Prime Minister Abe now wants to change the constitution, I mean, what we find is that there's surprising kind of resistance to the dramatic change in the constitution that would lead Japan to move away from its peace state identity. And so given that, it's unlikely that Japan is going to dramatically increase the amount of resources that it will put into the defense side, despite the increasing irritation and fear of China. And so what will be required is that Japan reform its defense system so that rather than thinking about a much larger pie of the defense budget, that it has to engage in structural reform of the defense forces and the defense establishment so that it becomes much more effective given the resource constraints. Fifth kind of major conclusion is that although we have a lot of discussion about a surreal high-intensity conflict scenario, that the most likely and the one that is most difficult to respond to is what we might call a low-intensity conflict, a low-intensity encroachment of China by China, not only into the Senkaku area, but in the East China Sea. And here, a blatant, hardline military response may not be the appropriate tool to deal with this kind of low-intensity encroachment. And as Michael Swain said, this puts a major highlights the role of diplomacy and how important that will be. The other thing is that, although there's a lot of discussion about Abenomics, what we found surprising with a lot of the long-term predictions of the Japanese economy, that even with Abenomics, we do not see Japan going back to some kind of very high levels of economic growth. And so, on average, over the next 17 years, Japan's annual increase in GDP will be a little less than 1%. So in the end, when we look ahead at 17 years, we generally see more continuity than discontinuity. And the only thing that might trigger a strategic breakout of the current pattern would be a radical shift in U.S. policy, which Michael Swain has said is unlikely, which is a precipitous withdrawal, or a very ultra-nationalistic, aggressive, and very strong China. And so the key thing then will be to avoid and manage incidents and potential crises. Now, finally, Mr. Watanabe thought that the audience might be interested in what the United States might expect from Japan. And as I said at the outset, we had disagreements within this research team about what we expect and what we want from Japan. But I think there was a general agreement that, first of all, we think it's appropriate that the United States and Japan continue to move ahead in integrating its alliance, institutionalizing this alliance so it becomes much more of a true alliance, and that involves the whole array of activities from planning, training, and operations. Secondly, since we don't see a large increase in resources devoted to the military sphere, that we think is very important for Japan to engage in defense reform. Thirdly, I think most of us on the defense in this team think that it might be a positive development if Japan reinterpreted or revised its constitution so that it could exercise the right of collective self-defense. But this does not mean then that this will translate into a militarized Japan, because there are all these other factors that constrain Japan. But even without a reinterpretation or revision of the Constitution to enable Japan to exercise its right of collective self-defense, since the greatest role that Japan can play in the alliance is to defend its area, that a lot of this could be done within the parameters of the exercise of individual self-defense. Now, there were differences of opinion about how far the security horizons of Japan should stretch. Many of us thought that it would be overreaching for Japan to think beyond its neighborhood, but others in the project thought that it would be helpful if Japan extended its security horizons all the way into the Indian Ocean. Now, finally, I think if there is some sense of agreement. Beyond the defense sphere, and Michael Swain has already emphasized this, is that given that it's unlikely that the United States and Japan alliance is able to sustain the primacy vis-a-vis China that it has enjoyed for decades, that it will be much more important for Japan to develop mechanisms of crisis prevention and crisis management with China and skillful diplomacy. But unfortunately, as we were doing this report, we saw very little of the skillful diplomacy on the part of Japan in its relations with China. Thank you.
Sure.
予定よりもちょっと短めでしたけれども、十分盛りだくさんのお話をいただけたと思います。ここからは東京財団の研究員も加わりまして、ちょっと討論したいと思います。今なんとなく思っていることをこのようにいろんなファセットから冷静に分析してフォーマットで見せてもらうと、これがまさにネットアセスメントなんだということがよく分かりましたし、また5、60年の間、日本が初めて迎えた非常に激動の3年間ぐらいにこの調査が行われたということからしましても、外から見て日本が今どこへ向かっているのかということが国内のみならず非常にこの地域に大きな影響を与えつつあるんだというのを改めて感じさせられるプレゼンテーションだったと思います。用意できましたでしょうか。ではここから、マイクをですね、本日のモデレーターを務めます浅野貴昭研究員に渡しまして討論してもらいたいと思います。お願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。それでは時間に限りもございますので、早速パネル討論の方に入らせていただきたいと思います。本日は、進行を務めさせていただく私、東京財団の研究員の浅野と申します。本日、今もうお話しいただいた、望月さんとスウェインさん、は、今回のレポートはカーネギー国際平和財団というところから、出しているわけですけれども、これは皆さんご存知の通り、外交安全保障からですね、世界の経済あるいは文化社会というところまで含めて幅広い、分野を取り上げて研究をしているシンクタンクでございます。で冒頭ですね、理事長の秋山の方からもご紹介申し上げましたが、このレポートをまとめる過程でですね、特に日本が関わる部分について東京財団と議論をしたと、カーネギー国際平和財団と議論したという経緯がございましたので、本日はこのような場をここで設けるということができた次第でございます。それでは、今、このレポートの概要をですね、お二人からお話しいただきましたので、それに対するコメントあるいは質問も含めてですね、日本側からいくつかまず提示させていただいて対話を始めさせていただきたいと思います。お一人5分から10分ぐらいのお時間をですね、ちょっと考えていただきまして、進めていただきたいと思います。それではまず、山口さんからお願いできますでしょうか。
ありがとうございます。今ご紹介いただきました防衛大学校の山口でございます。私は多分2つのコメントと2つの質問をさせていただきたいと思います。多分というのはどうしてもひょっとすると我慢できなくなって3つ目のコメントをしてしまうかもしれない。で1つ目のコメントというのは、最初にスウェインさんがおっしゃったように、このレポートはレンジオブシナリオズというか、それをいろんな幅があるということを提示をしたということで、非常にこれは意味があることだと思います。で日本がどうなるか、中国がどうなるか、アメリカがどうなるかということは非常に幅のあることでありますので、いろんなケースを考えていくことが非常に大事だということなんですけれども、それと同時に、それぞれ日本がどうなるか、あるいはアメリカがどうなるか、中国がどうなるかというのは、独立した変数ではないということですね。日本がどう動くかによって中国も変わりますし、中国がどう動くかによって日本も変わる、アメリカも変わるということであります。そうしますと、その日本シナリオというのが実は所要のなんて言いますか、所要のものではないと。 で我々が関与できる余地があるということを示唆していただいているんだと思います。そうしますと、次に大事なことは、その中のシナリオが、ライクリーかどうかということもさることながら、どのようなシナリオに我々が持っていきたいかと、そのために日米がどう働くか、あるいは日本、アメリカがその中国とどう関与していくかということが大事になるんだなということを、このペーパー全部を通じましてですね、強く感じて、次の我々の課題というのは、そのいわば我々のポリシーズですね、政策、施策というものを考えていくという必要だということが、私の第一のコメントであります。2つ目はもう少し戦術的なことになるんですけれども、この中に折に触れ、例えば日中間でクライシスなり、コンフリクトが、アクシデンタルに起きる可能性があるという危険が指摘されております。特に尖閣というところがなんて言いますか、フォーカスになっておりますけれども、実は尖閣というよりか、むしろもっと危ないのは南シナ海、東シナ海全体ではないかと思います。日本にとってはむしろ東シナ海全体の方がもっとひょっとすると危険なことがあり得ると。と言いますのは、中国の海軍、空軍、これはどんどん経済力が発展するに従って、近代化をされて、活動の範囲が広くなってきております。日本の海上自衛隊、アメリカ海軍とはもともと東シナ海から太平洋にかけて非常に活発に活動しておりまして、そこにもう一つアクターが出てくるということでありますので、出会う機会が非常に多くなると。つい数日前も潜水艦、どうも中国のものではないかと思われるような潜水艦が沖縄の近海に出没をしていると。これは実は極めて自然なことだと感じなきゃいかんと思うんですね。でその上で、例えば領海を守るとか、領域を守るということを日本なり、それは中国も一緒ですけれども、なんて言いますか、意図しない衝突みたいなものを防ぎながら、育ってくるといいますか、近代化されて、いよいよ活発になってくる中国の海軍、空軍というものと付き合わなきゃいかんということで、むしろ海上自衛隊、あるいは中国の海軍の大きな規模の部隊が動くのは、東シナ海全体でありまして、そこから宮古水道ですとか、日本の南西諸島の間を通って、太平洋なり南シナ海に出ていくわけですから、そこの密度の高いところというのを注視する必要がある。もちろん尖閣の管理といいますか、そこで火がつかないということは大事でありますけれども、東シナ海全体を見る必要があるんではないかというのが、2つ目のポイントであります。ここでまた我慢できなくなって3つ目のポイントこれ最後に望月さんが集団的自衛権のことをおっしゃいましたけれども、これは我々冷戦思考の中で、例えば集団的自衛権というものが日本が戦争に巻き込まれるというような形でどうしても考えがちですけれども、実はそれだけではなくて、例えば南スーダンに今陸上自衛隊の PKO の部隊が行っております。かつて、東シモールですとかハイチといったところに日本の PKO とか災害救援の部隊が行っておりますが、その場面で中国とか韓国の部隊と一緒になることがあるわけですね。でそういったときに中国の人民解放軍が自衛隊を助けてくれるのに、自衛隊が中国の人民解放軍を見捨てるというようなことになりますと、これは新たな歴史問題を作るということですから、そういうような意味も含めてですね、集団的自衛権の問題による制約というのは考えていくべきではないかというのが3つ目のポイントです。で、質問は2つに絞っておきます。1つ目は中国のなんて言いますか、将来に関するものですが、慎重なライズといいますか、慎重なコーシャスライズとアグレッシブなライズ、からあるいはコーポラティブウィークネスというのをいくつか見てみますと、どうもこの中では中国が弱ったら我々に対して弱い中国の方が我々と付き合いやすいというようなちょっとニュアンスが感じられてしまったんですけれども、我々日本には実るほど神戸を垂れる稲穂かなという言葉があります。中国が インセキュリティに陥るよりか、ある程度自信を持った中国で、強いリーダーシップが中国の中にあるという場合に、中国が柔軟になるという可能性をどういうふうにお考えかということが、その1つ目の質問であります。2つ目の質問は、アメリカのリバランス・トゥワーズ・エジア・パシフィックという言葉がありますけれども、いわばアメリカのアジア海域、これとの関係ですけれども、このレポートの中で、アメリカの将来については、アメリカが完全に地域から引いてしまう、あるいはこれが空洞化するというのは、アンライクリーだという、これは私にとっては非常に心強いことであります。かなり楽観的な見方ではないかという、アメリカの、予算の、国防予算の状況だ、あるいは中東ですとか、その他の地域のコミットメントを考えますと、それがなかなか難しいんではないかという観測が日本の中には強くあります。アメリカが残る、あるいはウィズドローワルとか空洞化するというシナリオがアンライクリーだという心強いアセスメントをされた理由を聞かせていただければありがたいと思います。以上で私
ありがとうございました。山口さんにはですね、この先ほど申し上げました東京財団とカーネギーとの対話の中にもですね、もうこの準備の議論の段階から、関わっていただいております。では今山口さんの方から、弱い中国の方が付き合いやすいのか、あるいはそのアジアへのコミットメントという質問がありましたが、ちょっとそこは覚えておいていただいて、まずコメントの方を先に言っていただきたいと思います。よろしいでしょうか。Afterwards?
Just keep it in mind.
Great. Thank you. 次はですね、東京財団研究員の小原さんの方から、コメントをお願いします。
ありがとうございます。東京財団の小原でございます。まずは非常に有意義なレポートを読ませていただきました。ありがとうございます。まず一つ、このレポート、理事長の方からもございましたように、相対的な分析、それも安全保障、これ、軍事力だけにとどまらず、外交、内政、経済、社会、こういったものすべての要素を考慮した上での相対的な分析というのは、これまでほとんど見たことはありません。安全保障は軍隊あるいは防衛省なり、そういったところだけがやるものだという概念は早く捨てなければならないんだということが求められているというふうに考えています。私はコメントいくつになるか明確に示すことができませんけれども、山口さんの発言にも触発されまして、まず東シナ海の問題ですが、やはりこれもドクター・スウェインの方からもございましたけれども、非常に変数が複雑であって、しかも変化が激しいと。今回、戦没潜水艦の接続水域内の航行ということが問題になりましたけれども、これは5月8日の人民日報の沖縄領有権未確定という論文、ここにのろしが上がっている、それ以降の中国側の新たなエスカレーションというふうに捉えていいんだというふうに思っています。人民日報の論文自体は特に中国が本気で沖縄を取りに来るという話では全くないと思います。ただ、エスカレーションをする、この際に尖閣周辺ではもうすでに取りうる手段はほとんど取ってしまっている。もうこのポイントだけではこれ以上エスカレーションを示すことができない。ですから、今度はそのエスカレーションの烈度ではなくて、範囲を広げる必要がある。とはいえ、東シナ海ではすでに中国海軍、空軍は十分に活動しているわけですから、何か意味付けをする必要があるんだと。こうしたときに、沖縄の領有権は未確定だという論文をもって、今後この海域で海軍が活動するときに、新たな対日活動ということを示す、これは国内に対してもですね、示すことになるだろうと。この背景には、一つは、日本の対応がどうも中国が思っているほど、日中関係改善の方に動きそうにない。ここで中国がこれ以上改善の働きかけをすることはできない。これをもって3月下旬頃から中国指導部は再度対日強硬に舵を切り直したわけですけれども、もう一つは中国の国内の状況が絡んでいるだろうと。 中国国内から同じことばかりやっていて、何の状況の変化もないと、これは現政権に対する批判につながる、現政権に対する批判というのが、中国の指導者が一番恐れることですから、これになんとか対応しなければいけない、こうした複数の要素がどんどん絡んでくる。とはいえ、経済的には中国は思っていた以上にダメージが大きいということも分かってきている。ですから、報道の方は若干トーンを抑え気味である。こうした状況を考えると、まさに今回、レポートで示されているような各要素を、変数を考慮しなければ、実際の今後起こりうる状況ですね、シビアな危機になるのか、それとも穏やかになるのか、しかもその穏やかな状況というのは、どういう状況かで穏やかになるのか、こういったことを分析するのは難しいんだろうというふうに思います。私の方から質問、あと2つさせていただきたいと思います。一つはやはり山口さんの第一の質問に関わる部分です。私も中国は経済的に成長率が大きくて、社会が安定しているときに必ずしもアグレッシブになる、経済成長が低くなって社会が不安定化したときに態度が穏やかになると必ずしも言えないのではないかという疑問を持っています。というのも、中国のこれは社会、政治、経済すべてにおいてですが、ありとあらゆるところに乖離がある。この乖離を中国の指導者は常にバランスを取りながらやっている。今、中国は経済に関して非常な閉塞感がある。市民は生活が非常に苦しいと皆が言っている。こうした中で、現政府に対する不満というものが溜まってきているということを、指導者はひしひしと感じているわけです。昨年の9月11日の尖閣諸島の購入の閣議決定以降のデモ、この際に毛沢東の写真を掲げて行進した者がたくさんいた、これを指導者は非常に驚き、恐れたということを言われています。というのは、毛沢東に回帰するということは、今、皆が等しく貧しかった時代を懐かしんでいるということですから、これは今まで改革開放を進めてきたその政策に反することでもある。さらには、今の政府が実際に公式に発表している今後の方針にも相反する。これは社会の中で決して豊かになれない人たちが豊かになる人たちをそばで見ていることに対する不満の表れ、さらにはそうした人たちが唯一勝利の高揚感を味わえるのが対日に関する部分。そうするとこうした複雑な状況が中国の中にはあって、必ずしも経済状況が悪化して軍事費に多くをつぎ込めないといった状況下が中国が穏やかになる状況とばかりは言えないのではないかと、そうした変数の考慮も今後必要になるのではないかという質問です。第2点は軍事の今回6つのセクターに分けられていますけれども、今回中国が発表した国防白書の中でも、海洋権益とともに宇宙とサイバースペースを、特に中国が防衛すべき領域ということを明示しました。これはアメリカでは第4、第5の戦場というふうに位置づけられているものですが、こちらに対する意識が今、中国では非常に高まっている。中国がシステムに対する意識を持ち始めたのは2001年、まさにEP3 が海南島に不時着をして、これを中国側が見て初めてシステムとはこういうものなんだという理解を得たと言われていますけれども、これ以降、ずっとアメリカの後を追従している。ところが最近になって、アメリカの後をずっと追従しているのでは永久にアメリカに追いつかないという議論も出てきています。そうしますと、今後、そうした技術をベースにして、中国独自の、あるいはもともとロシアの流れを組んでいるわけですから、アメリカとは違う武器システム、あるいは戦術の発展の可能性があるのではないか。そうすると、今の分析においては、 現状のそのままの未来への延長ということになりますが、将来、非対称のその軍事力が東アジアに存在する可能性というものも考慮すべきではないかというのが2点目です。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。小原研究員は、日中関係あるいは中国の軍事情勢という分野を中心に見ていると、おりますので、その立場から、今コメント質問を、していただきました。では、最後になりますけれども、渡辺上席研究員から、コメント質問よろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。望月さんが最初に17年前の話をしたんで、ちょっと雑談、本当は入れてる時間ないんだけど、どうしても抑えられなくなって、17年前、ガイドライン見直しの頃です。で、95年、私、実はワシントンに初めて行って、戦略国際問題研究所で、仕事を始めたときに、上司にウィリアム・クラーク・ジュニアっていう元国務次官補がいて、クラークからですね、日米安保最低限のセミナーやるんだと、ついてはこれとこれがパネルだと。でまずは君はブルッキングスの望月さんに電話して参加してもらうに頼めと言われて、恐ろしいんですけど、電話直接してですね、望月さんに初めて喋ったんですけど、その時そしたらばすごく快諾してくれて、望月さんっていうのはいい人だなって言って今に至ってるんですけども思い出しました。それでですね、実はガイドライン、見直し96、7やって、その後ないんですよね、日米同盟の。で今度ガイドライン見直そうと言ってる時期です。で対抗も防衛計画の対抗も見直そうという時期で、これに関して非常に参考になることが満載というのが、私の実はこのアセスメントの私の読み方、第一印象です。で特に私は日本に書かれた部分をよく読みました。先ほど望月さんが大変議論が分かれたと、意見が分かれたというのもよく分かります。なぜならばオプションに関して、アメリカは3つしかオプションというか将来の流れがなくて、中国は5つぐらいあって、日本も5つなんですよね。しかも5つの中でこれ興味深いのは、関与政策に関して3つのオプションがあって、つまりハードヘッジとソフトヘッジと、それから対抗的コンペティションの関与政策と。でハードヘッジが一番なる可能性が高い。でソフトヘッジがそうなる可能性高い。でコンペティションは可能性はある。この3つがあると。このぐらい結構丁寧に分けてあるっていうのは非常に面白くて、やっぱり意見分かれたんだなっていうのがよく分かります。で日本の行動についても2つの変数が想定されてましてですね、この2つというのが重要で、まず軍事上で中国にどう向き合うかという1点、それと米国との軍事同盟の協力の度合いと、まさに我々この2つ両輪で、どっちかじゃなくて両方をどういうバランスにするかって考える必要があるということですよね。でこれはハードヘッジのところを細かく読んでみると非常に面白かったんですが、協調的関与政策とハードヘッジ、まずその一つの根拠になっているのは2010年の防衛大綱なんです。それは日米の緊密な運用を協力すると、それから陸海空統合運用しますと、それからシームレスに危機対応の能力をつけますというようなこと、これが多分これやりますというふうなことを言ってる、これからやりますって話ですから、それがどの程度できるかっていうのを見ながら、防衛予算の組み方なんかも見て、やれそうかな、やれそうじゃないかなと見ながら、ハードかソフトか対抗的か決めてるのかなと思っております。で例えばハードヘッジだと GDP の 1% レベルなんですよね、防衛費想定してるのは。ただし、1% レベルでそれなりにやや上がりぐらいで、多分より効率的に法的なものを変えたり運用を変えたりしながらやっていくというイメージでしょうか。それからソフトヘッジの場合は GDP の 1% を超えないっていうふうに想定してます。これは多分どちらかというと今までの延長でやっていくっていうイメージでしょうかね。で対抗的関与政策、これを見ていくとですね、より日米のそのオペレーションが運用がですね大変緊密になるということで、例えばここで言ってるのはC4ISR の統合、それから 両国のCO4ISR、後で説明します、日本語で、ちょっと待ってください。両国の統合参謀本部、あるいは統合幕僚部ですね、日本だと。これが、ジョイントオペレーショナルコマンド、統合作戦司令部ですが、これ作ると。だから相当緊密になってると。で、軍事費は日本は GDP の 1.2% から 1.3%、これも長期的に見といた方がいいです。これどういうことかというと、年率 25% 伸びると。かなり大きいですよね。これ、なんでこういう話になるかというと、それはですね、アメリカが今後10年で軍事費が、4800億ドル最低限削ると。プラス、それの上に上乗せするんですよ。これシーケストレーションっていうんですけど、強制削減するということも考えると、アメリカ側もこの辺日本がどの程度までやってくれるのかなという期待が売られた時の失望も怖いからということで、やっているというふうな感じでしょうかね。それから、実はあともう一つ日本の考えることは、この3つの関与政策以外の2つのエクストリームな、割と大きな、日本がもうとにかく中国に妥協するということ、あとはアメリカが引いちゃって、中国と対決するために日本が核兵器持って対決していくということ、この2つ出てますけども、これ、日本の教訓はないかというと、つまり、これ、最初に、スウェインさんが言ってましたけれども、これは予想していることじゃないんだと、シナリオを書いて、それでどうなるかっていうことを見てるってことだと、これシナリオプランニングっていう手法もそうなんですけども、シナリオを書くことは占い師になることじゃなくて、どういう要素が、構成要素があって、それをどうすれば将来こうなるかと。つまり第4とか第5、特に第5ですね、第5になったらば、ちょっと日本きついですね。つまり核兵器持つお金かかりますよね、防衛費、すごくかかります。それからそんなことになったら、核不拡散体制は多分もう滅びてますね。で、中国との関係も悪化する。その金、どうやって、じゃあ日本は経済良くなってますかと、多分良くなってない。すると、例えば昔の第二次世界大戦の日本みたいに一生懸命みんなで我慢しながら軍拡するんでしょうね。北朝鮮のイメージですかね、今の。というふうにしちゃいけませんよねという話を読むんだろうと思っております。で、このもう一つ興味あるのは、このレポートが想定している時の中に、多分日本が考えるべきっていうのは、中国に対して一方的に強硬的なものでも、あるいは融和的なものでもない極端なオプションっていうのは取らない方がよっぽど関係はアメリカとも中国とも良くなるということ。ただし中国の取り方次第ではかなり、つまり中国が強硬に出たときは、あまり緩くやりすぎると、それはそれで結果的に良くな関係も悪化するし、日本のためにも良くないし、日米も良くないと。このバランスですね。これってちょっと日本人が考えることで、今までとかくというか、今も多分本屋さんとか、特に雑誌の見出しなんか見ると、極端ですよね。日中冷戦かとか、米中冷戦に巻き込まれる日本とか、あるいはアメリカは太平洋から引くとか。問題はそういう極論ではなくて、その中間に非常に難しいことがあって、その難しい中でバランス取りながら、いい方向に持っていくという覚悟は日本にあるのかと。で、その覚悟があったときに、どういうことをやらなくちゃならないのかと。2つあると思うんですね。このレポートでも書いてます。中国へのリアシュアランス。リアシュアランスって何ですかと。これ先ほど出ました。これは日本とアメリカが、中国が協力的なときに一方的に敵対的になんかなりませんよということ。ただし、抑止も必要だと、もう一つ。抑止はないかと。中国が冒険的で、安定的なことを乱すようなことをすれば、それに対してきちんと力で対応する準備もしてますと。これヘッジですよね。この通りだと思います。で、具体的に見るとですね、つまり対抗とかで考えなくちゃならないことっていうのは、ここで見ると、この本で見ていくと、日米安全保障協力で宇宙とサイバースペースの協力ってすごい大事だなっていうのが分かりました。それから C4ISR、これの死活的重要性です。と言って C4ISR って何かっていうと、一応日本語にしますよ。指揮、統制、通信、コンピューター、相互運用性、監視、偵察。つってもよく分かんないです。要するに軍事活動で安全保障協力で必要なすべてのコミュニケーションの確保、 あと運用性、相互に運用すること、これなので、これって実は相互運用性の鍵でもあるし、ここ攻撃されると日米で動かなくなるということでもあります。で、このレポート最後に指摘しています。日本の官僚制とか政治文化とか省庁の垣根を越えて、強い中央集権の力を作ることをずっと避けてきていると。これがなんかそういうことをちゃんとできなくしている問題だと思っております。なので、ここをもう少し政治とあるいは世論が決断する必要があると、こういうふうに私は読みました。で、質問です。こういうふうにいろいろ戦略的に考えている人たちからすると、例えば日本のこれでいきなり飛びますけど、歴史認識っていうのが大変今話題になってるわけですね。例えば一部の政治家なんかは非常に過去の話を非常に正当化しようと思って頑張ってるわけですけど、頑張りすぎて在日米軍持ち出すような人もいて、こういう話を聞いてると、一体あんたは日米中関係をどうしたいんだと、あるいは韓国との同盟どうしたいんだってことを聞きたくなりますが、で私が聞きたいのは、アメリカ側のお二人に、そういうアジアとの関係をうまくマネージできない日本というような要素っていうのは多分議論の中で出てきたと思うんですね。で、日本に対してアジアとのマネジメントをどういうふうに求めているのか、特に歴史認識だけではないんですが、そういうものに関して、その日本への期待あるいは不安、そういうものがあればぜひお聞きしたいなと思っています。
ありがとうございました。それでは今3方からコメントをいただきました。望月さん、スウェイさん、どちらからでも結構です。もしコメント、そういった質問にお答えを、いただけたらと思いますけど、いかがでしょうか。
I'll take the historical.
Well, thank you. Thank you all three very much. Very insightful and useful comments and questions. I guess one of the, and I'll try to cover as many of them as I can. One question I think that both Yamaguchi and Ohara-san had was this whole issue of a strong versus a weak China and its foreign policy behavior. In this report, I mean, we looked pretty closely at that question, and the general assessment that was made here was that China is unlikely to use foreign policy, that is to say, to provoke a foreign policy crisis, much less a conflict, to serve domestic ends. Now, let me be clear about what I mean by that. I mean, you have to distinguish between causing something and responding to something, and between a crisis and an actual military conflict. It's very much the case that Chinese leaders do not want to appear weak in the face of what they would see as a clear challenge to a vital interest. And questions of sovereignty, territorial integrity, that sort of thing, would be regarded by the Chinese as some kind of a vital interest. So if they are clearly seen to be challenged in this area in ways that are unacceptable, the Chinese leadership, partly for domestic political reasons, are inclined to respond in a way that is quite hard or quite tough. And that's really explains a lot of the dynamics that you can see in some of the, particularly the strong rhetoric that has come out of China in some respects. It's not all that, but it plays a role. But that's different from saying that the Chinese government would precipitate a very serious crisis or a conflict, much less launch war, in order to serve a domestic end. When you look at the history of Chinese behavior in foreign policy in the modern era, there is very little evidence, if any, that the Chinese government has resorted to aggressive actions overseas deliberately and unprovoked in some way, or not responding in some way simply because of a domestic issue. It's more likely that if the domestic situation is unstable in China, the Chinese leadership wants to stabilize the external environment. They don't want to deal with two crises simultaneously. And they recognize, I think, that trying to use a domestic problem to create a foreign crisis is simply too dangerous. You have to also keep in mind the current Chinese leadership is not like Mao Zedong. It's not like even Deng Xiaoping. The current Chinese leadership in general is much more cautious. It's more consensus-oriented, and I would say it's more conflict-averse. It doesn't have the same power and capacity to launch very aggressive actions and to survive if those actions if they fail. A man like Mao Zedong could do that. He had huge amount of charisma and power within the system. He could do something, and even if it didn't succeed, he was not thrown out of power. The Chinese system is far more complex than that. It's more balanced internally, and it is more cautious. And the Chinese know that their fundamental strategic objective, which they have yet to obtain, is economic development to a level that is sufficiently high enough that it provides enough welfare and social stability for China that they don't have to worry so much about their domestic situation. And that economic imperative is very much in the minds of the Chinese leadership when they think about how to handle these types of foreign policy issues. So in general, in the report, we saw it more likely that you would get an ultra-nationalist Chinese leadership coming to power in the context of economic development and stronger economic growth, greater confidence, but also a desire to control the domestic situation more. By that I mean just simply damp down the social unrest that might come through economic growth and continued rapid economic growth. And that a combination of that and confidence overseas and confidence in China's overall posture could lead, along with some kind of precipitating crisis like over the Senkaku or on the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan, would give hardline elements in China's leadership more leverage. So it's a very kind of contingent situation that could lead to those leaders emerging, and we don't see it as highly likely over this kind of a time frame. But that's very different from seeing a weak China resorting to force, etc. Now, one other issue that was raised was, isn't it possible that a strong China could be more flexible? I think Yamaguchi-san raised that issue, and I think that is absolutely the case. A stronger China could become more flexible in certain respects. And we don't discount that possibility. We certainly see it as possible that a strong China could retain an emphasis on cooperation in many, many areas, particularly global problems that affect both China and other countries, and including regional problems. The difficulty, of course, gets into the question of the specific kinds of disputes and tensions that exist along China's maritime periphery, maritime boundary. And that's right where Japan is. And Japan and China, with a stronger China, we think that China will become more wanting to deal with these maritime issues. That doesn't mean in a belligerent way necessarily, but they'll have more leverage. They'll have more influence, and they will try to use, I think, that leverage both positively and to some degree as a deterrent. They'll try to deepen the amount of cooperation that they can have with Japan and the alliance, while at the same time gradually showing that they have more capacity to act along their periphery if things don't develop well or if there are other developments outside of them that put pressure on them. And that's the kind of issue that we're dealing with in the report. It's not a simple question of a stronger China being more aggressive. It's a stronger China that has a variety of policies, some of which could be very assertive. Another question I'll do, and then I'll turn over to Mike, was one question is, why is American withdrawal so unlikely? I mean, we all may have our answers to that, but I guess from our perspective, from my own perspective, from having many years of experience in dealing with American decision makers and policy people in Washington, and knowing how they think about Asia, I think to some degree, I just find it almost inconceivable that an American leadership could make a decision, particularly in this time frame, that America's interests would be best served by withdrawing from the region. I mean, Asia represents an enormous asset to the United States as a stable, developing region. It's an increasingly important one, and the U.S. sees its role in Asia as critical to maintaining the prosperity and stability of the region. So a decision to withdraw, I think, would have to come about as the result of a very, very fundamental shift in American perceptions, the circumstances under which I find hard to imagine. It's very hard. It's not inconceivable because we deal with it in the report, but I certainly wouldn't put it up there as a kind of viable or much less likely option to be considered. And it's really not being contemplated in any imaginable world I can think of by U.S. decision makers. Mike, do you want to?
Maybe I should just start by also adding to Michael Swain's answer to that question. The Americans, I think, are tired of war because we've been involved in the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And so in that sense, I think the American people would like our soldiers to come back home. But that's different from continuing to remain a global military power that plays a substantial role in protecting the global commons. And you know, in addition to the interest in Asia, I think there is a sense of national identity about America's role in the world, and I think that that identity is unlikely to change. But another reason is that it's not that costly in the long run to stay in Asia. Now, I think, you know, over the next 17 years, there will be some drawdown in forces in Asia, and there ought to be. But that does not mean the extreme scenario of a total pullback. You know, there's another report that's just as long as ours that came out of RAND about the same time our report came out about overseas military basing. And it deals with the cost factor, and there is a way to stay in Asia but not be there in the same way that we are now. So, for example, it makes an argument that much of the Marines could leave Okinawa and come back to the continental United States, and we would still have a robust deterrence and crisis response capability. Some Japanese might see such a move as a withdrawal of U.S. military power from the region. Well, that's far from it. The 7th Fleet would still be there, and we would have major air assets in Japan, and also we would be developing a second hub in Guam. That's a readjustment of our force posture. It is not a withdrawal, and the United States can save quite a bit of money to do that. I think it's what Mr. Watanabe said is exactly right, is that so much of the discussion, I read the discussion in Japan, and it tends to be on the extremes. And really the reality is kind of in the middle, and there are different shades of gray, and we should become very aware of that. Now, I thank Mr. Watanabe for raising the issue about history and about Japan's role in Asia. We don't deal with that in this project, but it's something that I've been working on for quite some time. This is very troublesome for the United States, and it's not just about Japan and China. But I know, over the last several months, American policymakers have been at pains to try to understand what's going on between our two allies, Japan and the Republic of Korea. Why can't they kind of overcome the historical problem when there were many efforts made, from the time of Kim Dae-jung and Prime Minister Obuchi. And I think at the end of the day, there's a feeling that the United States is caught in this awkward position that those that most keenly support a robust defense policy that would help the United States in terms of Asia security are the ones that have a view of history that is counterproductive to stabilize relations between Japan and Asia. And that those that have a view of history that would be much more supportive of reconciliation between Japan and Korea and Japan and China are the ones who are much more resistant to the U.S. Hope and expectation about Japan on the security sphere. And that really makes things difficult. So although the United States welcomed Mr. Abe in terms of his agenda on the defense and on the economy, on the history, there is from caution to alarm. And I guess this is the thing, is that I always have trouble with this issue because I find that there isn't kind of an enlightened view of self-interest among those that don't know how to move forward on the reconciliation issue. When one looks at Germany, unlike Japan that has kind of a victim mentality about the history issue, Germans see it as a matter of national pride that they, more than other countries like the UK or countries like the United States even, that they've been able to deal with dark aspects of their history. And then that is a matter of pride, not a matter of historical masochism. And it frustrates me that Japan has not been able to understand that. The third thing about what kind of relationship that the United States might want to see Japan have with Asia. And here I will be very critical of the United States. In regard to Europe, the United States, from the end of World War II, had an explicit policy to encourage the development of a European community so that the possibility of war would be unthinkable in Europe. And I think largely U.S. policy has been successful. But in Asia, the United States has always been ambivalent about Japanese efforts to develop an East Asian community. And I think in the end, it's not a choice between the U.S.-Japan alliance and the East Asian community. The two are mutually reinforcing. But I thought that the Obama administration had a very short-sighted view about Mr. Hatoyama's vision of an East Asian community and thinking that such a policy was meant to exclude the United States. Part of the responsibility comes from the ineptness of the Hatoyama government to clearly frame the overarching vision that he had in mind. But the unfortunate thing is that a good, enlightened policy for Asia is now very difficult to promote in Japan because of the trauma of the Hatoyama government. And I think that's a very negative legacy of the Democratic Party of Japan.
ありがとうございました。本日はですね、中国の軍事力と日米同盟ということで、東京財団フォーラムを開催させていただきました。アジア海域に関してはですね、特に今アメリカの軍事予算削減ということもですね、アメリカの国内で、進んでいることは皆さんよくご存知のことと思います。今軍事予算削減のあり方についてですね、戦略レビューというものも進んでおります。今月末にはですね、それをめぐってアメリカのシンクタンク4つぐらいのシンクタンクが構想力を競うという、日本からすると非常に羨ましい状況が、進んでいるわけでありまして、今回のカーネギーのですね、このレポートも、そういったアメリカの政策コミュニティの力量を示す一つの表れ、そこを示すものでもありますし、これが今、コメントしていただいた日米中のその信頼構築のためのダイアログの道具として、ますます活用されることをですね、お祈りしたいと思います。では恐れ入りますが、最後はパネリストの皆さんにですね、温かい拍手をお願いしたいと思います。